And so Timaeus is the individual that Socrates says has gone to Egypt and talked with the Egyptian priesthood, and so he's relaying what Timaeus brings back from his visit to Egypt and the talk with the priests, who consider the Greeks to be barbarians. They have no history, no historical memory, basically, so they don't know anything, basically. But the point that seems to be most important that comes from the Timaeus is the argument that Plato gives us, that the concept of God has to relate to something outside of the universe. So if you think this is roughly 400 BC, and it's quoting the Egyptians, who we can presume might have had this concept for over 2,000 years before that, or whatever. And I think I've played some Akhenaten, right? To argue that it was Akhenaten that seems to have been the first monotheist, etc., right? But if we go back that far, what we're looking at, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, for example, God of God, light of light, true God of true God, what on earth are we talking about here? The Egyptians clearly argue, at least through the Timaeus. Don't know if we have any texts so far that clearly indicate that the Egyptians thought this way, but through the Timaeus at least, it's reported that they argue that the concept of God cannot be something that's part of the creation, because that would of course mean that the concept would refer to a creature as opposed to the creator, right? So you get the sense that even if our vocabulary seems antiquated, we might refer to it as a mythos, a mythology. It's nonetheless a indication of what our scientists today are certainly trying to do, and that is figure out what's the beginning of everything. How did it get started? Today, I think most often what I hear is the concept of the Big Bang. Was it, a single Big Bang, or was there multiple ongoing creative occasions? When we talk about a black hole, for example, we describe the black hole as a singularity where basically everything has collapsed. A star has collapsed into a point that's smaller than this, I suppose. And yet the mass of that is so great that even light cannot escape the gravity well of that collapsed star, which they believe now there are many of them. In fact, the center of a spinning galaxy like ours is considered, I think, to be a black hole. I don't know that you can actually prove it in a sense that you've seen it, because you can't see them by definition, because even light can't come out of them, radiation can't come out of them. And yet in Stephen Hawking's doctoral thesis, he argued that radiation does appear to come out of the periphery of a black hole, and his argument is that around the periphery of the black hole there's invisible matter, basically, that consists of both the quarks and the antiquarks, which when the quarks and the antiquarks are together, they negate one another, so there's basically nothing there. But around the periphery of a black hole, the gravity pulls in everything that's outside, including the nothingness, basically. And it's just a matter of statistics that a certain percentage of the nothing that's pulled into the black hole leaves half of it on the outside. And that's the creation of the quarks, because the antiquarks fall into the black hole while the quarks are left remaining on the outside. So when we look with radiology devices or whatever the heck they use, it appears that there is something streaming out of these black holes, which theoretically should not be possible. The explanation Hawking gives, of course, is that they're not actually coming out of the black hole, they're being created at the periphery of the black hole. So black holes then are related to the singularity of the actual Big Bang, which would have been essentially the same kind of thing in that theory. If that sounds even close, if you've studied this, you probably have a better grasp of it than I do. But that's just, of course, one ongoing theory. The other interesting problem, if you think of all time and space as existing at once, you end up with the dilemma of there not being a evolving development such as a Big Bang. Instead, everything from the very beginning to the end is essentially all there at once. And you wonder, well, okay, how was that accomplished? If not through the evolution from the beginning to the end, if everything all was created at once. As far as I know, we have no essential creation stories for that. How many of you have read Genesis from the Bible? Quite a few. It's kind of interesting. A lot of people haven't read much of the Bible. It's not mandatory, right? A lot of folks haven't read about Raven and how Raven created the world. Or is it Maui that creates it in the Hawaiian pantheon, if you want to call it that, right? I think Maui is the one that's fishing, right? And he throws the hook, and the hook catches something, and he starts yanking it, and the Hawaiian Islands eventually come up. But that's obviously a creation story with all sorts of things already available. Same thing with Raven, I suppose. Same thing with practically any other creation story. The idea of God stirring the waters, right, suggests, well, okay, so the water was already there. So those myths are water creation myths, and they were fairly popular. Babylonian myths were water myths. I think the Egyptian myths are water myths. Isis pouring milk or whatever from her breasts, down onto the earth, whatever. But both of those areas were dominated by rivers. So you had the Tigris and Euphrates for Babylon, and so they were entirely dependent on that for their farming. And then you had the Nile, of course, for the Egyptians. So the Nile is central to their creation myths. So those are water myths, in a sense. Water comes out of or the dry land comes out of the water. When we look at the first Greek philosopher, Thales, his description of things is a water myth. So basically he argues that water is the arche, or the basic building block of everything. The next generation argues with him that it can't be because air is more refined or smaller than water, right? So here we get the sense that air, is invisible, whereas water, you can see it. So clearly air must have come before water. So you have an interesting development there that, of course, we think of as the beginning of philosophy, because this seems to be a creation story without the concept of a God that's basically saying, let there be air, or something of that sort. By the way, in the Middle Ages, one of the more interesting theories was that God created everything with light. And that's kind of interesting, since today we definitely think of light as this, right, the particles that all come together to create things. It's kind of interesting. So let me So the article that we have from Plato is just one page, and I've only underlined the one piece here, the pattern of the unchangeable or of that which is created is the concern here, the beginning of everything for Plato. The Aquinas section, of course, this skips, 1,700 years, roughly. The Aquinas section is really based on Aristotle. And so Aristotle, of course, being a student of Plato, gives an interesting difference of opinion on how things must have been created. Plato, in his Timaeus, of course, just basically argues that God had to be there before the universe. But if you think of Plato's idealistic philosophy, the reason that there are things is because the ideas exist, and the ideas exist in the abstract sense, not in what we think of as the physical sense. So for Plato, the ideas come first. Matter is changing, corruption, produced by the demiurge, which demi in that sense doesn't mean half, but demi as in their divine, so a divine urge, which he also equates with love. So basically for Plato, love is what creates everything. The divine loves the ideas, and as a result, the ideas kind of are created, right, in matter. And as a result, we have physical things, right? Aristotle, arguing against his teacher, argues that there are no abstract entities, that in order for something to exist, it has to have substance, the first of the categories for Aristotle. And so he basically argues that there has to be a creation, a beginning, and that's created by the prime mover, which many people interpret as Aristotle's conception of God, right? The prime mover, the first mover. In other words, God can't be moved by something else, so God wasn't encouraged to have a world because something suggested it to him or it, but in the sense that there is anything, it had to be created by something else, and that we call God. So it's one of those classic explanations for everything that doesn't explain anything, because of course it's like saying, well, so God created everything, basically. And that's very unsatisfactory. If what you want to know is how all the pieces came together, what created the pieces in the first place, and so on. But so with Aristotle, we have a conception of an evolution of things, even if the originator was just God that said, poof, let it be, or whatever. So Aristotle's argument is then transformed by Aquinas into what he calls the 5 ways. There's really 4 ways that are based on Aristotle's arguments of motion, but the last one is based on Aristotle's argument of design. So the 5th way is the way of teleology, or design. And basically the way the arguments go is, well, stuff moves, but everything we see that moves has been moved by something else, and that has been moved by something else, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. By the way, if you're sleeping and you wake up, it's not because the alarm clock woke you up, it's because your mother and father created you, and you are a moving thing. So there's a way around that kind of dilemma. So everything moves because of some prior mover, but we can't imagine movement going all the way back to infinity, because of course if that's the case, then we haven't reached here. You see how that argument works? You ever puzzled this one out? Because if there wasn't a finite creation point, and instead there was an infinite of creation points that continue on, that conception would continue to go into the past. So the arrow of time would be going backwards instead of forward. And since we can't conceive of that, and that's our limitation, right? There must have been an actual beginning point, and that's creation, right? And in all those various arguments, there's 4 different ones that Aquinas uses. They're all basically the same one, though. You end up then with the concept of God as the prime mover. And the 5th one is the divine as a architect, that everything is so beautifully conceived and created that there must have been a designer, and that must have been God. It couldn't have been by chance. Of course, that was one of the main things that Darwin's arguments bothered people with, was the idea that you could have had the whole world basically evolving by chance. And that's still the problem with Darwin's theory of evolution, because if you do the math, and I remember Stuart Kaufman here from our complex systems group discussions pointing out that if you do the math, there's no way life could have developed in the short amount of time that the universe has existed, because there's so many possibilities that if basically all of those possibilities were tried out in relative sequence, that we would have never had the opportunity to get to the refined kind of universe that we live in now. So in that sense, there must have been some sort of designing principle that's behind the whole process that leads to now. Remember, of course, he talks about the finches in the islands, discovering how there's so many different finches, but they all seem to be evolved from the same basic bird, right? Today we know that birds literally will be born in an environment prepared for what that environment will have to feed them that year. It's just kind of amazing that the bills of birds will be designed for the fruits that will be available in the trees that year, which we don't know how they could predict it, but nonetheless, it seems that they know somehow ahead of time. Keep in mind, too, that we no longer think of our DNA as evolving by chance, but instead that the interrelationship between our environment is communicated to our DNA through our RNA, our messenger, they call it messenger, RNA, whatever. And so individuals do adapt to their environment, and those adaptations can be passed on to their next generation. So we've got lots of studies that show that now. So it's not a random chance thing, it's instead a interaction between the ability of living organisms to adapt to their environment and pass on their complex systems to the next generation. So that brings back the concept of design. And Lamarckian evolution, if you're familiar with that. Lamarck was the first one to argue that the current generation passes on learned behaviors to the next generation in their genes. And so there's always been this argument between Lamarckian evolution and Darwinian evolution. And I think I've mentioned that if you're interested in this, have a look at Stephen Jay Gould and his book, The Structure of Evolutionary Theory, which is a little book. That's my joke. It's a little book. because it's only, what, 1,200 pages, I think? Oh, sorry, 1,433 pages. So, little book, about like that. But absolutely fascinating. And what it does is describes the evolution of evolutionary theory. That could be funny. How evolutionary theory evolved. And by the way, that just demonstrates that the arguments today are not between evolution and whatever else you want to call it, creation theory, intelligent design, anything of that sort, but instead arguments over the type of evolution that there was. And it basically just means change. It's evolving. And how? How does it evolve? There's lots and lots of interesting developments in all of that. So, apart from that, of course, our astronomers continue to try to figure out the developments in the universe, where the universe came from, the oldest parts, the oldest possible occasion for the creation. You're familiar with the idea of the expanding universe, I hope? Yes? How that all works and why we know, or at least in theory, that's one true theory. Well, theories aren't true. Statements in theories could be true or false, but theories are interpretations of the statements that are true or false, etc. So there's kind of a grammatical element there. But theories are better than others. Some theories are better than others for the reasons that the theories are developed. So if what you're trying to describe is the apparent spread of the stars in the universe and the galaxies, etc., then those current theories are certainly better than the theory that everything all exists at once. Even if you take the Einstein light cone and you try to contrast that with any of those theories, you find yourself, remember the light cone just looks like time light cone. However you want to look at it. So if you're looking at that, how do you look at the past portion of that light cone and see a single or a singularity that explains that? Because it's actually expanding as it goes into the past instead of collapsing. In fact, if you're thinking of the expanding universe, it makes sense looking at the future of the light cone, but it doesn't seem to fit the idea that the past should have been essentially collapsing into a singularity at some time. It's because both of them, of course, expand, because the point of that model is to show how the speed of light is limited, and so at the point that we are at right this moment, the universe is collapsed around that particular point in time and space. It can't be faster than, nothing that's influencing us can be faster than the speed of light. And so essentially it's just that little point right there in the middle, right? But as you go into the future, of course, all of the things that are happening right now that can interact with us at the future point expands with the speed of light. Because everything within the speed of light, the star that's collapsing somewhere that creates a neutron star that then, or a pulsar or something else, then for maybe 20 years we could see it and be absolutely amazed. What is that? Tycho Brahe saw saw such a thing and argued at the time that therefore the heavens were changeable, which was totally heretical for him to say. But they didn't burn him at the stake, just Bruno, right? At least I know of. But he was crazy, so maybe he deserved it. Sorry, that's terrible. But it's confusing, of course, when you try to take the different models, they don't all fit together. So one of the neat things is trying to fit them all together. Then, of course, if you're a Christian, you also have the concept of Jesus Christ to fit into this development, because, of course, the concept of God is a Trinity. So not only do you have Jesus, but you also have, of course, the Holy Spirit as well. And so if you try to figure out how Jesus could be one with God, not created, right? You know, he's part of the Creator, right? Well, if that's the case, but at the same time Jesus arrives as a human being, how do you account for that, right? You know, that's another dilemma, and it becomes pretty clear that what they do in theology is play with different models to see which one can be used to be more coherent, the most coherent explanation for it. On the one hand, you've got to keep this as an essential element of the theology of that particular faith, and yet at the same time, it's incredibly difficult to make sense out of how you could have a trinity of one. You know, that's kind of a puzzle, of course. And by the way, one of the reasons the Islamic imams believe that Christianity is essentially a heresy, because as they argue that God is one, that's the emphasis that they keep making, Allah is all there is, right? Well, if that's the case, then, and you believe that Jesus is also God, and there's also some Holy Spirit, that's a Trinity, that seems to them to be heretical, etc. Is this fun? Am I boring you to death? Sorry. So, along with this, I also have, of course, the video that I posted of Miroslav Volf discussing things with David Brooks. And this topic...
Good evening. Welcome to tonight's conversation on character, flourishing, and the good life. My name is Matt Crosman. I direct the Life Worth Living program of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture at Yale Divinity School. And over the past 3 years, my colleagues Miroslav Volf, Ryan McAnally,
speeding up,
appears regularly on PBS Students Hour, NPR's All Things Considered, and NBC's Meet the Press. He teaches at Yale University, is a senior fellow of the Jackson Institute of Global Affairs, and is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He is a best-selling author of Hobos in Paradise, The New Upper Class and How We Got There.
So she's introducing David Brooks.
How we live now and always have in the future tense. The Social Animal, the Hidden Sources of Love, Character, and Achievement, and the Road to Character.
Our second guest of honor is Miroslav Volf, the founder and director of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture, and Henry P. Wright Professor of Theology at Yale Divinity School. Professor Volf studied philosophy and theology in his native Croatia and in the United States, and earned doctoral and postdoctoral degrees with highest honors from the University of Tübingen, Germany. His book, Exclusion and Embrace, was a winner of the prestigious Braumeyer Award in Religion, and Christianity Today named it one of the 100 most important religious books of the 20th century. His most recent book is Flourishing: Why We Need Religion in a Globalized World. Please join us in welcoming to the stage David Brooks and Miroslav Volf.
have an update. His newest book isn't Flourishing, it's this one, For the Life of the World.
Human Flourishing. Miroslav is for it, I'm against it. I actually come
That's
from
a joke.
conservative institutions that have been hostile to U.S. flourishing for decades. The New York Times, where I'm a conservative columnist, a job I'm lucky to be the chief rabbi at Mecca, and the University of Chicago, which has been hostile to my flourishing for 4 years. My favorite thing.
Can you hear him?
It's a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students St. Thomas Aquinas. Okay, so we'll start with a simple and obvious question. Your book is called Flourishing. What does it look like?
That's a great question to start. So, I think of flourishing as having 3 formal components. One component is life is going well.
So let me explain my thinking here. When we think about the creation, or we think about the various theories for the beginning of the universe, they're all trying to explain the same thing. What we basically end up coming to conclude is that we have no clue. I mean, we can improve our clues, so to speak, but when you get right down to it, we still end up with this confounding problem of how you can conceive of being arriving out of nothing. So because by definition, the creation must include nothing before it and all of a sudden everything after it, right? And that's just unconceivable to us. By the way, one of the best explanations of time, of course, the problem we end up with is the famous question, well, what was God doing before he created everything? If you don't mind my referring to God as a male. What was he doing? And, of course, the St. Augustine's answer in the Confessions is he was creating hells for people that ask such questions, right? And that's 420 AD, right? That Augustine gives us that answer. But then Augustine points out that time is actually part of the creation, so that there is no then before God created the universe, right? So time is part of the universe. So the puzzlement that we have of what was he doing before he created the universe is part of our limitation in thinking that there must have been a then. And of course, Augustine tells us there was no then, etc. So, but if you look at that puzzle, what's the significance of any of the answers that we give to that? And the significance, I think, comes in the way we conceive of flourishing. If we say, okay, so this is the model that we use to explain why there is everything. Notice the creation stories are all moral creation stories. There's a reason that the story explains things the way it does, and that is to give us, the readers of that story, the understanding of why it is we're here, right? So, in Genesis 1, you have what's considered by some to be the older of the two stories, where basically Adam's job is to give names to everything, right? So everything's all created, and Adam then is trying to basically say, okay, that's an elephant, that's a rhinoceros, that's a Tyrannosaurus Rex, right? Whatever they are, right? But then the second version is, of course, the more gradual evolutionary story, etc., to mostly point out that there are pairs of everything, male and female, right? And have we discussed how Eve came about in that version? Remember, God took a curved bone from Adam, yes? What bone did he famously take? to create Eve? Anybody? A rib. Well, a curved bone. Typically, ribs are curved, right? What other bone that mammals have that's curved could that story actually be referring to? Anybody know? Nobody want to say? Have any of you ever seen an Usyk? Nobody has seen an Usyk. I have an Usyk myself, actually. I received it in Nome from a person who harvested it from a walrus on the beach. Let me give you a... How do you spell it? Usyk. Usyk for sale. Let's just go Usyk. Or baculum, which is the Latin for it. I guess I could just click on this. What is a baculum? So here's various ones. Notice that you have a picture of a baculum from a dog. Notice. Here's one from a bear. What's of course important in these is recognizing the size of them. A raccoon. Interesting. I've never seen that one before. It looks pretty curvy. So here's a walrus one, around 22 inches. I've never measured mine, but it's about yay long. I should have brought it today. That would have been fun to pass around. The first time I saw one was in a gift shop in Nome, and they were asking $99 a piece for them. And I thought, wow, I'd love to have one of those, but at the same time, there was no way I had 99 bucks to buy one. But I ended up buying one from someone who was selling one not in the gift shop. I hope it's legal to do that. In any case, it was $25, so that was doable, right? But when I brought it home, my wife wanted no parts of it, so I had to stick it out in the garage. But my hope was that when my father finally came to visit us, remember we moved to Alaska, and when my father and mother came out to visit us, what I wanted to do was hand it to my dad and ask him what did he think it was. Because coming from Pennsylvania, we don't usually see baculums by themselves, right? And so, of course, he looked at it, and it went exactly as I imagined in my dreams, that I would hand it to him, he would look at it, and not know what it was, say a bone of some kind, and then I would point out, yes, it's a walrus stick, right? Which, of course, has that desired effect, etc., right? So here's the interesting connection to the story, of course. Apparently, all male mammals have a baculum, except human beings. So here's what I understand to be the Jewish interpretation of that curved bone, is that it's the baculum that was missing from Adam. We notice have all the ribs that we have and women have, I'm talking males, right, are the same. So there's no missing rib somewhere that could account for the story. But the curved bone that's missing is, of course, the baculum, which human beings are the only ones that do not have a bone in the penis. Sorry about that. That's not really the sort of thing you expected to hear, I guess, early in the morning. So you've always probably heard a rib was, the missing bone. That's not the way the originators of the story, well, at least the current speakers of Hebrew interpret that. By the way, there's all sorts of things you could look up that are, I'm not just making that up. It's not my fault. Okay, but so going back to the connection between the creation stories and flourishing. A problem, of course, we have with the evolution story, and that I'm applying also to the idea of the evolving universe, so the idea of the expanding universe, is a scientific attempt to explain the universe. And typically when they explain that, they also love to emphasize the creation stories that are anthropocentric, human-centered, right? Argue that the whole reason that the creation happened was so that we were here and doing our job. And we screwed up, and so God had to come and intervene. And now we're, of course, trying to work towards that second coming, etc. So basically, the whole creation story is all centered on humanity to explain the whole shebang based on our job, right? So it's a moral narrative. And as far as I could understand, all of the other creation stories of that sort are essentially also moral narratives that assign a particular job to us in order to be part of that whole story, right? But when you look at the narrative that develops with relativity and so on, not only do you get the idea that the universe, which, like, if you look at the very beginning of the universe, right, I forget the person that does it this way, and when human beings first arrive on the earth, it's like the very tip of this fingernail, right? In time, right? So when you look at the immense amount of time that science thinks the universe has been here, the amount of time that human beings have been here is like so infinitesimal and small and ridiculously, not a big part of everything, right? That almost goes with it. It's like they love to insult the idea that human beings could be central to the whole theory of creation, right? That's clearly not an anthropocentric universe. We, in looking at it as human beings, can want to make it look like it's all about us. But if you were an elephant, so they say, you would make God look like an elephant. If you were a horse, God would look like a horse, right? So that's, just kind of interesting ways of doing that. So part of the problem of revamping our creation stories in light of this scientific evolution of the universe takes away the moral foundation of the whole story, right? There's no morality associated with that, other than dog eat dog. That's everybody out for themselves, right? Becomes very puzzling, and to me it seems also interesting politically that those who would argue that it's not simply a competition and who beats everybody else, right? That it becomes politically incorrect to argue for that. So when I showed Helena, I forget, Cronin, right? Helena Cronin, and her argument about selection between, for example, the peacock and the ant and so on, right? Her book, The Ant and the Peacock, where she basically argues that the females selecting the males is part of the process. That is kind of politically incorrect because, but it's the dominant males that make the decisions, goes the theory, right? And that's, of course, that's being criticized by Helena. But you also have the problem with selfish The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins, and then you have the Unselfish Gene. Not only does he get to write a book and call the gene the selfish gene, but of course immediately other people will say mean genes, right? There's other books, mean genes, that they're mean, they fight one another, right? But then you get the altruism, right? The concept of altruism, that basically people will actually sacrifice themselves for the good of others. And then, of course, Susan Blackmore comes along with the meme machine, which suggests that we could be so fascinated with the concepts that we're spreading around that we give up on our own memes and are just interested in spreading our memes instead of our genes, right? So if you think about it, typically, at least in the West, and actually Buddhist monks are the same, although you can be a Buddhist monk for a couple of years and then go back to your family and continue to have what might be considered a normal life. In the West, after about the middle of the Middle Ages, it became a requirement that the priests be celibate. Of course, we all know that that doesn't actually happen. But the idea, of course, was that you're dedicated to God and passing on the faith instead of your genes. And so in a sense, Susan Blackmore's point that you can be so excited about memes that you're infected with, right? Remember, they're life forms for her, right? So you can be infected with these memes and then basically give up on your own, passing your own genetic material on, and instead just focus on passing on the memes. I can see myself in that. What are my main motivations for things? Learning more memes myself, and then spreading them because I think that's so exciting. All my adrenaline and serotonin are all wrapped up in ideas. I'm like, oh, that's just me, right? So I pass that on to others. So I'm addicted to memes, I think. Always looking for some fresh memes, to have for breakfast, etc. See where I'm going with this? So Miroslav Volf strikes me, and David Brooks. It's not just these two, of course. There's a whole slew of interesting individuals that are all arguing over this problem of how the modern Nietzsche is another example, Kierkegaard is another example. All these folks that are post-Hegel are basically trying to negotiate with this evolutionary narrative that Hegel gives us, and the idea that our morality develops. And the end result, of course, is that we end up with narratives that tell us that no narrative is better than another. They're all okay. You can have your own, whatever floats your boat. Whatever is really inspirational to you, that's fine for you. Whatever you find inspiring, that's good for you. That's essentially the romantic point of view. From the romantic period. I don't mean romantic as in Romeo and Juliet, but as in the romantic period. The idea being that the importance of your belief in a narrative is the emotional attachment you have to that belief, not what belief it is. You could be a communist, you could be a socialist, you can be a capitalist, you could be a Grundewald, you could be any of these. And what's inspiring to us is the amount of emotional commitment that you make to it, right? Not what it is that you're committed to, but what's inspiring is just how enthusiastic you are over it. Wow, because kind of the bad thing is not having a commitment in the first place. Wow, you have no commitment? No. Oh my goodness, that's terrible. You have to have a commitment. else why do you get up in the morning, right? And that seems right. Without having a narrative that explains why you get up in the morning, it seems hard to explain why you would actually get up in the morning, right? Why do you overcome any barriers if you don't have a reason for it, right? So along with this modern interpretation of creation comes the dilemma that the moral narratives are useless, unbelievable. And then what do you do? In fact, it seems like the moral narrative today is that you're an idiot if you believe in one of the traditional moral narratives, because after all, we've superseded them. So then what, right? What do you believe that gives you a sense of moral purpose? And that's where I find Miroslav Volf to be an exceptional individual in this regard. Let me see if I can even... Here's a section I found interesting. Universities and the meaning of life, and why this? So there's two institutions we have in our Western culture that we would think still would deal with a meaningful life, flourishing, as they're discussing, right? And those are, number one, the university systems, and the other, church systems, right? And by that, he also means temples, synagogues, etc., right? So of those two, you would think you'd be able to find some help by going to the university to learn what's the meaning of life. By the way, of course, I find this especially pertinent since that's basically one of my main foci in my class, right? Because it bothers the heck out of me and has bothered me since 1970, right? So here's his explanation of the problem with universities today and the meaning of life. One might think that colleges and universities would be the places for sober explorations, I don't have my glasses on, of the nature of flourishing life, pushing against the deadening effect of the work and fun loop we don't know how to escape, right? Why do you otherwise go to the university? Just to get the best resources so that you can go out and have the resources to have the most fun. But in trying to have the most fun, you need more resources, so you have to compete with others to, right? So it's a loop, right? And we don't know how to escape it. Perhaps in an early season of their lives, which I imagine you're in, right? Young people would learn to think intelligently and critically, not merely about how to succeed in one or another of their endeavors, but about how to succeed in the endeavor that is their life itself. After all, from its beginnings, whether we trace these to Socrates or to the founding of modern universities in the Middle Ages and throughout most of its history up to the mid-20th century, higher education has centered on the question of the meaningful life, true life. The American idea of college was invented more or less precisely as a space in which one could ask and answer the big questions of life. But the great invention has lost much of its original purpose. Our colleges and universities have largely given up on the meaning of life, to use the phrase that occurs in the subtitle of Anthony Kronman's book about higher education, Education's End. Remember, I think I mentioned that in that he's referring to not the end of education, but the aim of education. Remember, the same as Fukuyama's the end of history, right? Incremental increase in knowledge of the world and in the advances of technological know-how are valued over truth-seeking explorations of meaning and purpose, especially in an age in which education needs to justify itself in economic terms, which doesn't that fit in our current situation, especially with the budget, et cetera? It seems the focus should be that our university system ought to be primarily aimed at giving you specific tools that enable you to get out and earn more money so you can have more resources. That's the fund loop, the resources fund loop, etc. So his feeling is that the university system has kind of given up on this. Not all of them. There are certainly some, yay us, I think. And then when he turns around and talks about the churches, he says many of those have given up also on it. They become places where you just go to get cheered up on Sunday morning, instead of, et cetera. Very interesting. But so, let Miroslav Volf speak for himself a little.
For one. The other component is life is being led well. And the third one, in some sense, life feels also good. The first, life going well, describes the circumstances of our lives. We need to have certain level of peace in social settings. We need to have our bodies nourished in certain ways for us to be able to say that we flourish. Second is life being led well. We need to act in ways that are appropriate. We need to have a form of character that is appropriate. And the third component, probably very popular these days in the wider culture, is life has to feel good, feel right. And that can be, sometimes people think of it as unimportant in some ways, but at the same time, without a sense of life feeling right, we cannot be said to flourish. In the biblical traditions, both Jewish and Christian, these are summed up in terms like peace, for life going well, righteousness, for life being led well, and joy, for life feeling just right.
As you're speaking, I'm thinking of Kanye West. He would say, my life is going well, I got a lot of money, my life is being led well, Taylor Swift hates me, and I'm certainly feeling good about myself. So that seems maybe not as tight a definition as one would want.
Well, I think those are formal components of it, right? So everything depends not so much of all these.
So I'll leave you to watch that in full if you haven't already, or if you're interested. Good discussion, I think. Lots of good ones out there. But I'll quit at that point, unless you have questions or anything about the topic, or about the term paper, or about term paper groups, if you're interested in getting together with some of the others to basically just work on that. Remember, it's not a group grade, it's instead each of you has an individual grade on your term paper. But a lot of folks think it's a good idea for individuals to work together on projects like that. I'll leave it up to you. I'm not actually grading you for your participation in a group or not. It's just an individual grade. But it looks good on the syllabus. That's kind of important. It looks like I'm pedagogically correct in that sense, because it's kind of a current emphasis. And there's a reason for it, by the way. It's supposedly better for you if you have friends. I agree with that completely. But whether or not your fellow students can be counted among your friends, that I think is more of a difficult problem for especially a commuter campus. Everyone's driving in and leaving and not living here, not spending extra time here, meeting other people and so on. I have to admit I cheated, as I've done in so many different other ways, by living on a campus when I was a kid, and basically living on campus, never leaving campus. I did have a job, but that was basically all the time I was there with friends. even eating meals, right? So we didn't have meal privileges in our campus house. We instead had to go to the dining facility on the campus. And so every breakfast, lunch, dinner, we had to walk all the way down to the campus dining facility and get in line with the tray, with the, mostly peanut butter. It was mostly peanut butter we lived off of, big bowls of peanut butter. That was terrible, actually. I remember the one time I was sitting there eating noodles, and I looked at the noodles, and there were little things crawling around on my noodles. And I was fine with that, but my future wife sitting next to me, she was absolutely appalled. She said those are worms or something, that were still alive in the cooked noodles, crawling around. And so she insisted that I take them back and show the chef. So the two of us, she walked me back, and I went to the chef, and I said, look, there's worms in there. He says, those are not worms. And he took my dish, and he dumped it into the new pot of noodles that he was making. So the evidence was gone, as you can imagine. And they were getting recooked, to make sure that, they... So that was the kind, so that was... But you have to admit, it was cheap. It was $10 a week for all 3 meals, 7 days a week. So we paid $180 for all of our food for the whole semester. That was it. That's kind of cool. But so that also means that every meal I'm sitting there with a table full of, right, you start meeting people, you tend to like certain people, or they like whatever, right? So yes, there was a group of friends that all through my years there were pretty much the same group of people that we got to know. And I married one of them, so that's pretty cool. I got scared to death that once I graduated, that I would never ever be in a circumstance where I could meet another woman. I could not foresee how you would be able to do that, right? Because once you get out there in the world, it's like, how are you going to meet other people? I couldn't figure that out. So I wanted to make sure I married one of the ones that I had already met on campus. So I would you marry me? Would you marry me? Would you, And Donna didn't actually say yes. She laughed when I asked her. And I assumed that meant yes, so that was kind of interesting. But so yeah, if you need the occasion to have friends, it's supposedly good for you. You should have friends. In fact, the happiest we ever are is when we're having meals with friends. Does that make sense? You ever heard that? I suppose that's psychology. So have meals with friends. And you could discuss your term paper if you like. That would be a good idea. Any questions? Or?
What's the question of the day, or is there a question?
Slavoj Žižek is soon to be 70 years old. What's his birth date? Is that a good question? It's not a very, very thought-provoking question. Slavoj Žižek. He will be 70. Should I send him a card? I should send him an email, I suppose. I could send him a gift. I could send him my husik. See if he figures out what it is. Oh, I know what I want to do. So I should send him a message. Actually, I have no clue if he actually reads these. What's it mean, 107K people? 107,000? It seems low, actually, for him. Not very thought-provoking. You might add to it and wonder, should he continue to live? Should he continue to live? You think? You think? Not as far as I know. No, he's amazingly busy. According to his bio, he's teaching at several universities. How do you do that? Especially when they're like in different places in the world. You know, Berkeley, however you say it. You know. Plus, you know, in his hometown, he's a professor at the university there. That's in former Yugoslavia, Slovenia, I think. He speaks Slovenian, Serbian, German, French, English, but he also publishes in Polish journals. But I mean, all of the Slavic languages I can follow them, so I'm sure he does fine. So.
What did I miss at the beginning of the class? So the group that.
Okay. So on the syllabus it says that groups are assigned today.
Okay.
And the idea is that you can use a couple of other students in order to have them proof your paper so far, to help improve it, that kind of thing. And so, of course, a lot of folks ask, okay, so what's this business about groups? And so I want to emphasize that it's not the group that's getting the grade. Everyone in the group gets their own individual grade for their own individual term paper. So I didn't mean to imply that. But at the same time, theoretically, it's a good idea for students to work together with others on projects and stuff, because it really annoys students to have to do that, because you end up then meeting the other students and discovering that they're not very cooperative. You try to make a date. Okay, let's all meet at the coffee shop, at a certain time, and you show up and none of the others are there, and they totally farted you off, etc. And so that's, I think, the normal experience. Does that sound about right?
Kind of.
You ever heard the story of when God talked to Adam? And he says, I can create you as a creature. She'll cook, she'll clean, she'll beautiful, she'll make you the most happiest creature in the world, but it's going to cost you an arm and a leg. And Adam says, what can I get for 2 ribs?
2 ribs?
Rib.
Oh, rib.
Yeah.
It should be a rib. Yeah. Did you like that story, by the way? That interpretation of the curved, it's a curved bone. It doesn't say a rib.
Yeah.
It's just normally translated into English as a rib, but
That makes sense.
it's not my fault.
Didn't hear the question, the quiz question.
Oh, Slavoj Žižek will be 70. And my question was, when's his birthday? You can find that instantaneously, actually. I mean, in fact, the reason I knew it was because everyone's talking about it. Because he's going to be 70. That seems to be a significant age, I suppose.
What was his name?
Slavoj
Slavoj
Žižek.
Žižek.
Yeah, Zizek.
Z-I-Z-E. Thank you.
But that's a terrible. I mean, there's no thought behind that question whatsoever.
No, it wasn't. He's
Say March 20.
born in 19